Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves drifting through a warm, humid summer evening in colonial Pennsylvania. You're standing in an open field, ankle-deep in soft soil, surrounded by rows of baby mulberry trees swaying slightly in the dusk. The sky is streaked with the last blush of orange and violet, and someone nearby is humming a hopeful tune while inspecting a wooden box full of something squirming. Don't panic, it's just a fresh shipment of silkworm eggs, still dormant, waiting for the right temperature to hatch into something squishy, demanding, and historically disappointing. You brush a mosquito off your arm and wonder if you're witnessing the beginning of something grand. A new industry, maybe. A transformation of this quiet, wooded part of the colonies into a humming capital of fine textiles and wealth. But spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this silk industry. Because, like most good ideas in early America, it's about to unravel faster than a poorly spun cocoon. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love imagining where in the world you're falling asleep from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all starts with dreams, specifically dreams of silk. Not the scratchy homespun stuff of everyday frontier life, but the fine, slippery threads of imported luxury that glittered on the sleeves of European aristocrats. Silk was more than just a fabric in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was status, opulence, and the smell of money. In England and France, it adorned royalty. In China, it was practically divine. And for the colonists, it represented a fantasy that maybe, just maybe, they could grow something more than corn and frustration. Back then, Pennsylvania was considered a land of opportunity. Rich soil, mild seasons, in theory, and settlers who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. It didn't take long before someone looked around and said, "You know what this place needs? A booming silk industry." And because it was the 1700s and optimism was practically a currency, people took that idea very seriously. Enter the mulberry tree. The white mulberry, Morus alba, native to China, is the silkworm's preferred food. Actually, its only food, which is really inconvenient if you're trying to grow worms in a forest full of maple. So naturally, Pennsylvania colonists began planting mulberry trees with a missionary zeal. If they couldn't grow silk directly, they'd at least grow the food to fuel it. Soon, nurseries across the colony were advertising young mulberry saplings for sale, sometimes even giving them away to encourage domestic sericulture. Entire communities got behind the idea. Children were taught the basics of worm rearing in school. Churches blessed silk seed. Even Benjamin Franklin weighed in, suggesting that silk might one day become a viable industry for the colonies. But if you know anything about silkworms, you know they are finicky little creatures. They require constant warmth, humidity, and trays of freshly plucked mulberry leaves, morning and night. And even then, they're prone to illness, overcrowding, and the occasional dramatic death spiral if things aren't exactly to their liking. Basically, they were the aristocrats of insects, and most Pennsylvania homesteads were run by people who could barely keep their chickens from freezing. Still, the dream didn't die. The plan was simple. Plant enough trees, hatch enough worms, and spin enough silk to supply a domestic industry that could rival the imports. Families converted spare rooms into worm chambers, lined with wicker trays, and warmed by brick hearths. Girls were trained in spinning the fibers once the cocoons had been boiled, a step which, by the way, kills the worm, so moment of silence. Everything seemed promising. The climate was just barely suitable. The soil, excellent for tree planting. The settlers, determined and deeply bored during the winter. There were even a few small batches of Pennsylvania-grown silk woven into thread and displayed with pride. But, and there's always a but, a factory never followed. Despite the early promise, no full-scale silk processing facility was ever built. Not in Pennsylvania, not in the surrounding colonies, not even after statehood. Plans were drawn, proposals were floated, and every time, for one reason or another, the idea just unraveled. Sometimes it was funding. Sometimes it was politics. Sometimes it was a late frost that wiped out half the mulberry crop in a single cruel week. Other times it was just the realization that silk production is very labor-intensive, and that colonists had other more pressing things to do, like not starving. And then there was the worm problem. Even when they managed to raise a healthy crop, turning cocoons into silk thread was a delicate and specialized task. Spinning required machines that didn't yet exist locally, and importing them was expensive. The alternative was hand spinning, which took forever and yielded so little that it became clear the math just didn't work. You could feed 10,000 worms for weeks, harvest their silk, and still end up with barely enough for one gentleman's cravat. Still, Pennsylvania held on longer than most places. It was close, so very close. But without a factory, without a central processing hub, it remained just a lovely idea. A prototype dream on a hand-drawn map. So here you stand, next to a hopeful farmer in 1760, holding a leaf up to a tiny gray worm that seems wholly uninterested in doing anything useful. There's talk of a factory, there's a petition, there's even a barrel of bricks and timber set aside in someone's barn. But that factory? It's never coming. Certainly. Here's Section 2. Section: You're still in Pennsylvania, but a few decades have passed. It's now the early 1800s, and the silk dream hasn't died. It's just put on a fancier hat. The American Revolution is over, the country is growing, and there's a renewed sense of national ambition. In parlors and print shops across the young republic, silk isn't just a luxury anymore, it's a patriotic opportunity. This time around, the talk isn't just about feeding worms and hoping they feel inspired. It's about becoming economically independent from foreign goods. Imported silk, especially from France, China, and Italy, was still wildly expensive. If America could grow its own, that would mean less reliance on European textiles and more self-made prosperity. It was the kind of idea that made congressmen nod seriously while stroking their cravats. So once again, eyes turned to Pennsylvania. It had land. It had farmers. It had just enough temperate weather to keep worms alive, at least some of the time. And most importantly, it had people with big dreams and no shortage of enthusiasm. In towns like Easton, Lancaster, and Reading, real estate agents and local boosters began whispering about the coming silk boom. Local papers ran cheerful columns about sericulture, complete with helpful diagrams and breathless optimism. Entire towns pitched themselves as the next Lyon or Nanjing. If you squinted at a map and ignored the actual climate, Pennsylvania looked like the perfect silk state. The Great Mulberry Rush began. Mulberry trees, especially the white variety beloved by silkworms, became the Bitcoin of the 1830s. Nurseries planted them by the thousands. Farmers devoted entire fields to cultivating saplings. Real estate was sold with promises of prime silk-growing land. Pamphlets advertised that anyone, even school teachers and blacksmiths, could start their own silk empire with just a few eggs and a pile of leaves. Prices soared. Mulberry stock was traded like gold. One especially infamous variety, the Morris multicaulis, was hyped as the miracle plant of the century. People bought it on credit. They planted it on hillsides, in front yards, along fences, and inside glass houses. Some farmers even started cutting down profitable apple orchards just to make room. And through all this, there was still no factory. Plans were drawn, of course. One proposal near Harrisburg promised a silken mill of industrial elegance, complete with imported Italian reeling machines. Another, in Chester County, called for a workers' village, where orphan girls would be trained to spin and weave American silk into dresses for the modern Republican lady. But time and again, the projects fizzled. Investors dropped out, contractors ghosted, machinery got delayed or lost or stuck in customs. Sometimes the builders just forgot where they put the blueprints. Meanwhile, everyday people kept planting trees and raising worms, waiting for infrastructure that never arrived. In the meantime, towns tried to improvise. A barn would be hastily converted into a spinning room. An old grist mill would host a few rickety reels, powered by a stubborn water wheel that mostly just made noise. Silk was produced, technically, but in quantities so small they were barely worth noting. Often the fibers were coarse, uneven, or too short to weave. Many were simply discarded. Worse, the silkworms didn't always cooperate. Pennsylvania's weather was moody, to put it kindly. Spring came late, summers could be dry, and sudden cold snaps were known to kill off entire broods of silkworms in a single frosty night. Entire families would spend weeks tending trays of worms, feeding, cleaning, watching, and then wake up to find hundreds of little white corpses and a house that smelled like overcooked cabbage. And still, people tried. Because the dream was strong. Women's magazines of the time published silkworm care guides. They framed the whole thing as both a domestic art and a patriotic duty. Raising silk wasn't just profitable, it was moral. It kept women busy. It gave them purpose. It could be done from the home. And the idea of American-made silk became tied to the broader ideal of Republican virtue. No more fancy European nonsense. This was homegrown, homespun, and entirely respectable. There were even competitions. Fairs and exhibitions offered cash prizes for the best home-raised silk thread. Judges walked through displays of cocoons and skeins with magnifying glasses, nodding solemnly at the quality of the filaments. A few women won ribbons. Their photos, well, sketches, appeared in local gazettes. Some towns crowned silk queens who wore homemade sashes and rode in parades next to wagons full of mulberry branches. But none of it could scale. Not without a real factory. Not without machines and trained labor and stable demand. And those pieces never quite fell into place. Then came the crash. Like all good bubbles, the mulberry mania burst. The Morris multicollis market collapsed almost overnight. It turned out that mulberry trees weren't quite as magical as advertised, and the imported worms weren't built to handle Pennsylvania's unpredictable mood swings. Farmers who had mortgaged their homes for silk dreams found themselves surrounded by useless shrubs and debts they couldn't pay. Some tried to sell their silkworms by weight. Others just burned everything and quietly went back to potatoes. And as for the factories, still unbuilt. Still paper sketches. Still coming soon, according to a flyer now faded and stuffed in the back room of a tiny library somewhere. So here you are, standing on the edge of a hill in central Pennsylvania in 1839, looking out over 1,000 mulberry trees. A neighbor waves from his porch and says, "Just wait till the factory comes. We'll all be rich." You nod politely and keep walking. You don't have the heart to tell him. It never comes. Certainly. Here's Section 3. Section 3. By the 1840s, if you wandered through the right stretch of Pennsylvania countryside, you'd find all the signs of a thriving silk economy. Neatly planted mulberry groves, silk reels sold at general stores, pamphlets about worm rearing, even polite posters in town squares advertising eggs of proven Chinese lineage guaranteed to hatch. It all looked so real, so imminent. You could practically smell the silk scarves fluttering in the breeze. But look a little closer and you'd notice something off. The trees, for one, were everywhere, overgrown, tangled, and, more often than not, abandoned. The leaves were supposed to be tender, fresh, perfect for the fussy appetites of silkworms. But most of them had gone woody and dry. You'd see sheds and barns full of empty trays where worms once wriggled, now covered in dust and mouse droppings. That silk factory everyone kept talking about? Still a rumor. The land had been cleared, the ground marked, but nothing had ever been built. A few hopeful bricks sat stacked in a corner, slowly sinking into the mud. The enthusiasm had outpaced the reality, as it so often does. But let's rewind just a bit, because this wasn't just about trees or worms. It was about timing. You see, America was changing. The Industrial Revolution was underway. Cities were growing. Railroads were spreading. Labor was shifting from farms to factories. And suddenly, people started realizing that silk, beautiful and romantic as it was, wasn't really keeping up with the speed of the times. Especially not the way Americans were trying to do it. Raising silkworms wasn't like growing wheat or building a mill. It was delicate, repetitive, slow. Every cocoon had to be boiled, every filament teased out with fingers or primitive tools, then twisted into thread before weaving even began. It was a process designed for patience, and patience was rapidly going out of style. To make matters worse, overseas competition wasn't sleeping. China, Japan, and parts of Europe already had generations of expertise. They had factory systems, trained weavers, and export networks that dwarfed anything Pennsylvania could dream up. Imported silk flooded the American market, cheaper, smoother, and more consistent than anything backyard operations could manage. And no matter how loudly local boosters shouted about patriotic silk or freedom fibers, the buyers knew what they wanted. And what they wanted wasn't homegrown lumpy thread spun in someone's cellar by candlelight. So why didn't they build a proper factory? The short answer, they tried. The long answer, they didn't try very well. Dozens of proposals were floated. Land was purchased, shares were sold. Some even broke ground. But building a silk factory required more than good intentions. You needed skilled workers, specialized equipment, capital that wasn't tied up in mulberry speculation. And you needed consistency, regular, reliable supplies of cocoons that didn't die off every time a Pennsylvania spring decided to snow in April. What they had instead were amateurs, well-meaning folks, to be fair. Farmers, school teachers, ministers, wives, all convinced they could rear worms in between their regular duties. But worms don't care about your chores or your children or the fact that the cow got out again. They want warmth, quiet, clean trays, and 5 fresh feedings of mulberry leaves every day. And when you fail them, oh, they let you know. Many households suffered full silkworm die-offs, sometimes from mold, sometimes from cold, sometimes from overfeeding. One lady in York County accidentally introduced vinegar to her worm trays while trying to freshen the air, and killed all 3,000 in a single day. She later wrote to her cousin that it smelled like pickled ambition. Others tried to cheat the system. They mixed in leaves from other trees. They tried raising worms in barns instead of homes. Some even reused old cocoons, hoping they'd spin again. They wouldn't. By then, word had spread in farming circles. Silkworms were more trouble than they were worth. Even in towns that had started branding themselves as silk capitals, people began quietly pivoting back to wool, flax, and butter churns. And still, in libraries and courthouse basements, plans for silk factories gathered dust. Occasionally, a burst of hope would flare up. A new inventor would claim to have a reeling machine that made silk production fast and foolproof. A wealthy landowner would offer to underwrite a mill. But every time, something would go wrong. The worms wouldn't arrive, the leaves dried out, the machine broke, the money vanished. And in each case, the dream stalled again. Meanwhile, the mulberry trees became local jokes. Kids dared each other to eat the bitter berries. Birds nested in their branches. Old-timers shook their heads and called them money trees that never bloomed. Some towns passed ordinances to cut them down. Others left them standing, quiet monuments to an ambition that never quite wove itself into reality. Back in town, someone still talks about the factory. There's always one. An elderly man at the general store, a local historian with a folder full of maps, a sign nailed to a post near the creek that reads, "Site of the proposed Eastville Silk Works, 1842. No silk ever came out of it. No machinery ever ran." But the dream, absurd as it seems now, lingers like the sweet smell of old paper and sun-baked bark. And maybe that's the most Pennsylvania thing of all. Certainly, here's Section 4 of your bedtime history script. Section 4. Now picture yourself in a dim little farmhouse parlor in rural Pennsylvania, around the year 1841. The floorboards creak with the weight of too many generations. The hearth is cold. It's spring, but just barely, and the windows are fogged with a stubborn mix of damp and soot. On the table lies a folded handbill printed in smudgy blue ink. Silkworm eggs for sale. Pure Mongolian strain. Hatch guaranteed. Ideal for ladies, children, and gentlemen of industry. See Mr. Pettibone, Lancaster Depot. You smooth the paper with one hand. The other clutches your cup of sassafras tea. Because yes, this is you. In this world, you've just decided to become a silk producer. Congratulations. It starts innocently enough. You've got a few mulberry trees behind the barn. You've cleared a shelf in the spare bedroom. You've written away for a rearing pamphlet, which includes helpful diagrams like proper coddling angle of egg cradles and worms at rest, 4 critical poses. You feel informed, empowered, maybe a little itchy with anticipation. The eggs arrive in a tiny wooden box, wrapped in linen, no bigger than buttons. They're grayish, dull, utterly unimpressive. You expected magic. These look like dirty pebbles, but you're committed. You place them gently in their cradle, shield them from drafts, and wait. Days pass. Then one morning, you wake up to the faintest of rustlings, like the sound of dried paper fluttering in a breeze. They've hatched. Thousands of hair-thin creatures writhe on the cloth. Their bodies are translucent, like tiny ghosts. They're hungry. You panic slightly, race outside, and tear mulberry leaves from the trees until your arms are full. The worms devour the leaves like soft machines. It's oddly mesmerizing. You feed them 5 times a day. Each time you approach, they've grown. Thicker. Longer. Hungrier. They poop constantly. The room starts to smell sweet and green with a murky undercurrent of something fungal. Your neighbors ask if you've taken up fermenting turnips. You laugh, but you're also exhausted. Then comes molting. The worms stop eating. They go rigid. They look dead. You panic again. But this, the pamphlet says, is normal. You wait. A day later, their skin splits. They wriggle free, shiny and new, a little larger, a little more opaque. This will happen 4 times. Every time, it's horrifying. Every time, they survive. You're bonding with them now. You've named a few. You whisper goodnight when you leave the room. You've stopped using the spare bedroom entirely. Friends stop visiting. You no longer care. Finally, the spinning begins. Each worm lifts its head like a dancer preparing a final bow. It moves in figure eights, releasing silk from its mouth. Over 2 or 3 days, it seals itself into a perfect golden oval. You watch them hypnotized. It's beautiful. It's strange. It's a little bit tragic. You've raised them for this. And now they're vanishing inside. But you can't get too sentimental. Because if you wait too long, the moth will emerge, and then the cocoon is useless. The key is timing. Once the worm has finished spinning, you have to boil the cocoon. Alive. You hesitate. You were told this would be part of the process. But you weren't prepared for the feeling. They trusted you. You named one of them Clarence. But the thread won't harvest itself. You gather your courage. You boil. You dry. You unwind. The thread is thin, gossamer, impossibly fine. You try reeling it around a spindle. It snaps. You try again. It snaps again. You feel like you're trying to braid a spider web. This, too, was not in the pamphlet. Eventually, with patience and a kind of grim resolve, you manage a bundle of thread. It's coarse, uneven, sticky, but it's yours. You imagine it becoming a glove, a ribbon, maybe even, dare you dream, a bonnet trim. You bring your product into town. No one wants it. The dry goods man smiles politely but says imported silk is smoother. The dressmaker says she prefers her usual supplier. The merchant at the milliner's stall offers you 20 cents, then laughs and waves you off. You feel crushed, not just because the effort didn't pay off, but because, for a few weeks, it all felt real. The pamphlet promised a cottage industry. The town committee said this would be the future. You believed them. You gave it everything. And now you're trudging back up a muddy lane with a half spindle of sticky silk in your pocket and the smell of boiled worms in your coat. You're not alone. Across Pennsylvania, stories just like this are playing out. Maybe not all with the same poetic self-destruction, but close. Some families never get their worms to hatch. Some can't keep them alive. Others produce good silk, but never find a buyer. A few go in on expensive reeling machines only to discover that the mechanics jam after 10 minutes of use. But for every failure, there's still someone clinging to hope. Maybe next spring, they say. Maybe with better eggs. Or, if we just had a factory, then it would work. You say the same thing, quietly, over dinner, to no one in particular. And meanwhile, the worms rest in their cocoons, silent and still. Open quote. Section 5. Let's wander now, slowly, softly, into the grand old daydream that refused to die, the Pennsylvania silk factory that always felt just one step away from happening. You wouldn't believe how many versions of it floated through newspapers and parlors in the 1830s and 1840s. Sometimes it was called the American Silk Palace. Sometimes the State Cocoonery. Sometimes, boldly, just the mill. People talked about it like it was already halfway built. A few even claimed to have walked past the construction site. Spoiler, they hadn't. Still, that didn't stop the vision from spreading like soft fire. In this imagined building, the silkworms would have their own sun-drenched annex, a glass house packed with rows of wooden trays stacked 6 high. Steam-powered reeling machines would whir rhythmically in a tiled spinning room. The walls would be clean and cool, echoing with the gentle clack of bobbins, and the occasional distant sneezing fit, because of course the place would be full of powdered mulberry leaf dust. Women and children, dressed in crisp aprons, would work carefully, winding raw silk into thread, dipping their hands in warm water, laughing quietly. Some people swore there was already a contract in place for bricks, but really the only thing getting built was the dream itself, layer by hopeful layer. And the most determined dreamers? They weren't always businessmen. They were often women. A certain kind of woman, to be precise, one with ambition, limited property rights, and a highly developed tolerance for nonsense. Many of them had read the same magazines, scanned the same silk culture columns in Godey's Lady's Book or The Farmer's Cabinet. They clipped out diagrams, traced plans, and went half mad trying to keep the worms alive in guest rooms, pantries, and occasionally even dresser drawers. You, dear listener, were absolutely one of them. Of course, you didn't have the means to build a whole factory on your own. But you had neighbors. You had tea parties. You had influence. So you started dropping hints, just casual at first. Well, I do hear the reeling process is best done in a temperate environment, something like the old barn on Lancaster Pike. Or, Mrs. Hollingsworth's daughter has an eye for fine thread. She'd make a perfect mill assistant, don't you think? People nodded. They sipped. Someone mentioned that Mr. Kincaid down the hill had an old loom gathering dust in his attic. Another neighbor chimed in that his cousin in Connecticut had heard of a man selling a second-hand cocoon oven for cheap. A factory began to form, first in words, then in drawings on scraps of butcher paper. Some people even held public meetings. In one church basement, a group of 12 women formed the Pennsylvania Female Silk Cooperative, complete with hand-inked charters, elected officers, and a treasury box filled with $6 and a ribbon someone had reeled by hand. There was talk of applying for state funding. And why not? Pennsylvania's Agricultural Board had been enthusiastic about silk for years. In theory. In reality, the board was underfunded, vaguely skeptical, and preoccupied with pig cholera at the time. Still, the dream clung on. A local newspaper published an editorial praising the ingenious and feminine spirit of enterprise sweeping the region. That was you, by the way. Ingenious. Feminine. Spirited. Possibly a little unhinged. You and your fellow dreamers wrote to senators. You collected testimonials from fellow cocoon raisers. You compiled a list of every mulberry tree within a 10-mile radius. A hand-drawn map of your ideal silk mill appeared in the county fair. It had ivy-covered walls, a beehive-shaped boiler, and tiny stick-figure workers cheerfully boiling cocoons. People were charmed, but no one wrote a check. Weeks passed, then months. You got distracted by a foot injury and a sudden outbreak of mildew. Mrs. Hollingsworth's daughter ran off with a bookseller. The ribbon in the treasury box got eaten by moths. The man with the second-hand cocoon oven moved west. Mr. Kincaid's loom got sold for firewood. And just like that, the silk factory evaporated. But not in the way a bad idea dies. More like the way a bubble does. Gracefully, in silence, leaving a shimmer behind that makes you question if it was ever really there. Here's the thing, though. Nobody actually wanted to give up. It was just that everything else was heavier, more urgent. Chickens had to be fed, cisterns had to be repaired, babies had to be burped, and silk, well, silk could wait. That didn't stop you from saving the map, though. You kept it neatly folded in the back of your recipe book, tucked between the pickled beet instructions and your grandmother's handwriting about vinegar foot soaks. You didn't even look at it often. But knowing it was there, that mattered. It still does. Because there's something stubborn in dreams like that. Something silk soft, but iron strong. Even if the factory never rose from the ground, the idea that it could have, that you were part of the reason it almost did, that's not nothing. You still look at mulberry trees a little differently. Section 6. So, about those mulberry trees. If Pennsylvania Silk Dreams had a secret mascot, it wasn't a worm or a loom, or even a determined woman with a clipboard. It was Morus multicaulis, the Chinese white mulberry tree. Specifically young saplings of it, which began showing up in nurseries and farms like uninvited guests, who then started charging rent. You've seen them, haven't you? Frail-looking things at first. Pale trunks, leaves like green mittens. Nothing about them screamed revolution. But in the 1830s, these trees were gold. Not metaphorically. Literally. People were paying absurd prices, like actual wall of shame auction prices, for the promise of a crop that would one day feed thousands of ravenous silkworms. The whole thing had a name, the multicaulis craze. It started innocently enough. A few horticulturalists noticed how much better these Chinese varieties did compared to native red mulberries. They were faster growing, leafier, easier to prune, and this was key, much easier to propagate. You could grow hundreds from cuttings. Naturally, Americans took that fact and sprinted straight into speculative mayhem. Before long, the humble mulberry sapling was being treated like a kind of greenback stock certificate. People were buying and selling cuttings the way modern folks flip NFTs or rare sneakers. A single rooted sapling could go for a few dollars. In bulk, entire fortunes were made. Newspapers printed mulberry price indexes. Land agents bragged about their tree counts in letters to potential investors. Some folks got into bidding wars over lots of twigs. And you, of course, got curious. You weren't reckless. You didn't empty your savings or remortgage the house like poor Mr. Belden across the creek. But you did buy a handful of cuttings, 7, to be exact. From a traveling salesman with a mustache like a paintbrush and a trunk full of enthusiasm, he gave you a tiny pamphlet and a firm handshake, promised they'd grow tall and leaf-heavy in no time. "Your fortune's in the soil, madam," he said, tipping his hat like he was auditioning for a vaudeville production called Confidence Man, the musical. You planted those trees with a kind of careful reverence. You dug neat, symmetrical holes. You watered them with collected rain. You read aloud to them on warm afternoons, part science, part superstition. You whispered your factory plans into their leaves. By midsummer, they'd sprouted up to your knees. By fall, you were trimming branches for cuttings of your own. You weren't alone. All around your township, neighbors were doing the same. Pennsylvania's fields, for a brief and glorious moment, looked like a leafy dreamscape of possibility. But like all speculative bubbles, the multicolours madness couldn't last. Here's the catch. Mulberry trees grow fast, but they're not magic. And silkworms, fussy little things, need very specific leaf quality. Many of the young trees, especially ones grown in poor soil, produced brittle or undersized leaves. Worse, they often grew too fast, sacrificing nutrition for height. And some of the trees being sold weren't Morris multicaulis at all. They were just sticks, painted green. You may have figured this out after your neighbor's saplings failed to sprout, and he started muttering darkly about scams and curses. Or maybe it hit you when you saw the first silkworms refuse to eat from one of your trees, turning away dramatically like fussy nobles served the wrong wine. Prices collapsed practically overnight. Nurseries went bankrupt. Cuttings that once sold for $5 each were now 2 cents a dozen. There were stories, more than a few, of farmers feeding mulberry leaves to pigs just out of spite. Someone made a joke in the Philadelphia Inquirer about silk being the devil's floss. But here's the funny thing. Your trees didn't die. They didn't make you rich. They didn't get your factory built. But they kept growing. Slowly, patiently. Their trunks thickened. Their leaves deepened. A few even bore tiny white fruit, sweet and sour and sticky as dreams half fulfilled. You didn't pull them out. Why would you? You liked them. They were proof that you'd once believed hard enough to plant something. And in a quiet way, they were beautiful. Years later, you found a small wooden box beneath the pantry floorboards. Inside, one silk ribbon you'd made from your third successful reeling, still soft, still faintly scented with vinegar and hope. You pressed it between the pages of your mulberry-growing pamphlet. The ink had faded. The trees outside hadn't. There's something to be said for that kind of endurance. You learned a lot from those mulberries, not just about worms and fiber and speculative markets, but about patience. About how some investments bloom in stranger ways than you expect. Maybe not in wealth or fame or factories, but in shade, in sweetness, in memories that rustle in the wind long after everyone else has moved on. It's strange how something so small could carry so much. But then again, that's the thing about trees. Section 7. You know what nobody warned you about? The smell. You'd heard 1,000 things about silk farming, how delicate the worms were, how lucrative the industry could be, how Chinese emperors once guarded sericulture secrets under penalty of death, but nobody mentioned that your charming barn full of baby silkworms would soon smell like a combination of wet cabbage, sour milk, and faintly roasted almonds. Silkworms, bless them, are not glamorous house guests. They arrive tiny, pin-sized specks with translucent skin and very big appetites. You hatch them carefully from little paper-wrapped eggs, warming them with nothing more than sunlight, your breath, and perhaps the occasional nervous lullaby. They squirm in slow, purposeful spirals, entirely dependent on you and your mulberries. And then they begin to eat. No, devour. You had no idea anything could eat that fast. You would spend your mornings gently snipping mulberry leaves, selecting only the freshest, most supple ones, then carefully shredding them into ribbons for feeding. You laid the green strips over the worm trays like you were garnishing tiny salads. The worms responded with loud enthusiasm. Yes, loud. Silkworms in groups make noise, a dry, papery sound, like dozens of tiny mouths chewing very close to your ear. You thought it was rain the first time. You stuck your head out the window and looked for clouds. Nothing. Just worms feasting like it was their last supper. Which, in a sense, it was. They grow in fits and starts, shedding their skins in strange, silent molts. Their bodies go rigid for hours, then emerge larger, glossier, more urgent. You watch this with a mix of fascination and mild horror. By the third molt, they're long enough to curl across your palm like a warm bracelet. And still they eat. By now, your neighbors have stopped asking politely about your hobby. Some just drop off old baskets of mulberry leaves at your porch like peace offerings. Others wrinkle their noses when passing by your barn. One particularly vocal cousin mutters about plague and pestilence every time she visits. You ignore them. You've got silk on the brain. Then comes the big moment. Without warning, the worms begin to climb. It's a biological signal. Their final meal has passed. Their bodies are full of the fibrous proteins that will soon be transformed into cocoons. You place little bundles of twigs, called mountages, in the trays, and the worms eagerly scurry up to attach themselves. Then the magic starts. They spin. With a slow, hypnotic movement, they rotate their heads in tight, rhythmic circles, pulling fine threads from spinnerets near their mouths. Each cocoon takes up to 3 days to complete. You watch, mesmerized, as the gray barn fills with white silken pods, each one trembling slightly with the movement inside. They're beautiful. Cloudy ovals suspended like ornaments. You whisper congratulations to them. You say things like, "Well done, little architects, and I hope you dream of mulberry leaves." You don't tell them what comes next. Because here's the thing. To harvest the silk, you can't let them finish their transformation. If the moth inside breaks out naturally, it ruins the long thread. So tradition demands that you interrupt the process. Gently. Section 7. You know what nobody warned you about? The smell. You'd heard 1,000 things about silk farming, how delicate the worms were, how lucrative the industry could be, how Chinese emperors once guarded sericulture secrets under penalty of death, but nobody mentioned that your charming barn full of baby silkworms. Section 8. You don't exactly plan to start a silk movement, but somehow word gets out. It starts with your neighbor's daughter, the one who always stops by to feed the chickens stale corn muffins. She sees your shimmering threads drying by the window and blurts, "That's real silk? From your barn?" You nod. She gasps. By the next week, the postman asks if he can see the worms. 2 days later, someone from the Pennsylvania Gazette wants to do a little feature. "The Silk Farmer of the Forest Edge," the headline reads. You groan at first, but also, you cut out the article and press it in your notebook. Suddenly, you're getting letters. Long, looping script from curious strangers. "Dear Madam, how many worms do you recommend for a starter crop?" Others ask if you'll sell eggs. One bold letter simply reads, "Heard about your thread. We're trying it in Scranton. God help us." It feels like a movement in miniature. A hush-hush club of enthusiastic amateurs, all whispering to each other through ink and paper. You write back, of course. You send detailed instructions on how to care for the worms. You make tiny diagrams of reeling equipment. You even press mulberry leaves in the envelopes, just for fun. By spring, you've got protégés. There's a school teacher in Carlisle with a converted tool shed full of larvae, a retired glassmaker in Harrisburg who built his own mountage racks from broken windows. One particularly ambitious group of women out near Lancaster, who call themselves the Sarah Collective, host monthly silkworm tea parties. You don't ask what's served. You're not just making silk now, you're making community. And yet, something still feels off. Every time someone says you should turn this into a real operation, your stomach drops slightly. You smile and nod, but you also think of your worms. Not as inventory, but as pets. You think of their soft crunching, the way they curl into your palm, the tiny way they tremble when molting. Could you really scale this up? But one morning, there's a knock at the door that changes everything. He's wearing a stiff gray coat, spectacles balanced precariously on the edge of his nose, and carrying a black leather satchel. He introduces himself as Mr. Dunning from the State Board of Agriculture, though you suspect he's just someone's cousin with good penmanship and a borrowed badge. He'd like to evaluate your operation. You invite him in, offer weak tea, and try not to stare as he pokes around your humble barn setup with the expression of a man judging pies at a county fair. He makes occasional sounds. He scribbles notes. He sniffs a cocoon. He asks how many spindles you could theoretically fill per week, given optimized conditions. You say, 3, on a good week. If the worms aren't moody. He does not laugh. After a long pause, he removes a folded document from his satchel. It's covered in stamps, flourishes, and the kind of language that makes your eyes blur. Commonwealth Initiative for the Promotion of Domestic Silks, 1839. It seems that the state wants to fund you. Not just you, actually. A factory. A big one. On real land, with real workers, and machines. You blink at the word machines. Apparently, someone up in Philadelphia has decided that Pennsylvania should become the American lion. The future of fashion, they say, must no longer depend on the East. Silk is the fabric of progress, of elegance, of empire. And you, small-scale, eccentric, mulberry-stained you, are proof it can be done. All you have to do is say yes, and hand over your worms. Okay, not literally, but they'd need your starter stock. Your eggs, your formulas, your notes, your approval. And ideally, your name attached to it all. You'd be credited as founding consultant, he assures you. Possibly honored at the centennial. Centennial's decades away. You tell him you'll think about it. That night, you lie awake under the gentle rasping of 100 silkworms nibbling their midnight snack. You imagine a grand factory with brick chimneys, workers in aprons, crates of imported mulberry leaves. You imagine your name painted on a sign in gold. You also imagine those same worms trapped in wire trays under harsh gas lamps. Processed. Automated. Treated like livestock instead of miracles. And something inside you wrinkles like a bad thread. You don't sleep much. The next day, you pack a bundle of your best cocoons. You write a letter. Dear Mr. Dunning, you begin. I regret to inform you. You don't send your worms. Instead, you keep reeling. Quietly. Patiently. One thread at a time. And as summer deepens, your porch fills with little bundles of white silk, each one glistening faintly in the morning sun, just enough, you think, for another scarf. Or maybe a ribbon for someone's hair. And while Pennsylvania almost had a silk factory, it had something better first. You. Section 9. In the weeks after declining the offer, you expect some fallout, maybe a second letter, or a visit from a sterner government man with a sterner mustache. But no one comes. At first, that's a relief. Then, it's eerie. Because while you go on feeding worms and sketching real designs and answering silk enthusiast letters from across the state, you remember what was promised. A factory, a movement, maybe even your name stitched into the state's industrial future. But Pennsylvania? It shrugs and moves on, and soon, everyone else does too. Your protégés begin to slow down, the glassmaker in Harrisburg stops writing, the teacher in Carlisle says her school board disapproved of the smell and made her dismantle the tool shed setup. Even the Sarah Collective in Lancaster disbands after an unfortunate incident involving a spilled kettle, a cocoon basket, and what one guest described as a gelatinous silk soup. You sigh. This dream, this soft, glimmering thing, seems to be unraveling. So you focus inward. Your silkworms become fewer but more cherished. You name them again, tiny names like Bramble and Button. You give them little moss hammocks. You start spinning not just thread, but meaning. You embroider your thoughts into handkerchiefs, stitch your memories into gloves, whisper your doubts into the weft of ribbons you don't sell but give away freely to passing strangers with sad eyes. One day, while gathering mulberry leaves, you meet a young woman sitting on a mossy stone wall. Her dress is patched, her boots too large, and there's a fraying journal tied to her waist with a shoelace. She asks you, timidly, if you're the silk lady. You pause. She opens her journal. Inside, tucked between notes and pressed ferns, is one of your letters. One you'd sent to someone else, years ago. Your handwriting still careful. Your ink still slightly smudged at the edges. I found this in my grandmother's trunk, she says. She tried the worm thing for a while. I think she gave up, but I didn't want it to end there. You bring her home, show her your worms, let her feed them leaves. She cries when she sees them up close, how soft they are, how translucent their skin, how quiet their little lives. She stays for tea. You give her a basket of cocoons. You write your instructions again. You teach her. And when she walks away, clutching the basket and journal close to her chest, something inside you feels like it's breathing again. Not long after, more girls arrive. Word spreads, but softly this time, like the whisper of silk itself. They come by cart, on foot, in pairs or alone, often with letters in hand. They don't ask to industrialize you. They don't bring contracts. They bring bread, mulberries, curiosity. And so your home becomes not quite a school, not quite a commune, more like a sanctuary. The worms thrive. Your porch buzzes with gentle talk and tea steam. You keep a ledger, not of profits, but of projects. A scarf for a widowed mother, a sash for a girl's graduation, a pouch of cocoons donated to a school in Altoona. The worms are no longer just insects, they're legacy. And the idea of a factory? It seems more and more like the punchline to a joke you no longer need to tell. One foggy morning, you open your door to find a man in a neat brown suit, holding a ledger. Oh no, you think, it's finally happening. He introduces himself as Mr. Greenleaf from the Franklin Institute of Practical Arts in Philadelphia. He's not here to fund you, he's here to record you. We've heard stories, he says, gesturing to your porch full of silk-wrapped embroidery frames and giggling apprentices. And frankly, we think your little operation is more remarkable than anything the factory would have accomplished. You let him in. He watches, listens, takes notes, asks smart questions, doesn't flinch when a caterpillar escapes into his cuff. He stays the weekend, eats too many scones, and leaves with a tiny handkerchief embroidered with a single word, almost. Weeks later, an article appears in the Scientific American supplement, The Gentle Rebellion of Pennsylvania Silk. It's full of praises. Your attention to quality, your humane treatment of worms, your impact on rural women's livelihoods. The title sticks. People start calling your little setup the Gentle Rebellion. You roll your eyes, but privately, you adore it. You make no money, but the legacy blooms. And that factory? Years later, you hear it was almost built. Twice. Once in 1847, again in 1853. Each time, the funding ran out, or the machines broke down, or the public lost interest. Silk, it seemed, refused to be forced. You look out at your porch. Your worms are molting. A girl is writing a lullaby to sing to them. Someone is dyeing silk with crushed marigolds. A child with ink-stained fingers is drawing a worm with a tiny crown. You smile. Pennsylvania never got its silk factory, but it got something better. A quiet legacy. Thread by thread. Section 10. The years keep drifting by, soft as the silk you spin, and slowly the buzz around your gentle rebellion settles into something even quieter. Folklore. You don't notice it at first. Too busy boiling cocoons, teaching girls how to reel thread without snapping it, or experimenting with walnut husk dye that leaves your fingernails looking like you've been gardening in sepia. But it starts to come through in letters. Not from institutions or inventors anymore, but from dreamers. Children. Poets. People who heard about your house from someone's aunt, or a man in the train station who had a silk ribbon tucked in his prayer book. One letter comes with a pressed violet and a story scrawled on brown wrapping paper. A schoolboy in Allentown convinced his teacher that silkworms are a metaphor for reincarnation. Another arrives on birch bark, written in charcoal, from a girl who says she talks to her worms and believes they sing back. You begin to realize something unexpected. Your home, and your odd little movement, is becoming a kind of soft myth. Not the thunderous myths of founding fathers or steamboats, but something gentler. A parable of what could have been. A story people whisper to remind each other that not all revolutions wear boots and break glass. Some of them spin cocoons. Meanwhile, your home is now an unintentional museum. The dining room is stacked with skeins of experimental thread. The hallway walls are lined with botanical illustrations drawn by students long gone. A girl once painted an entire fresco in your pantry depicting the life cycle of the silkworm as if it were a medieval saint's biography. You left it there. Every spring, the porch gets repainted by a different girl with a different dream. One year it's daffodils, the next, stars. One year, a girl writes a poem on every plank in white paint. A poem you read nightly for weeks until it fades from foot traffic. And though the original dream, the factory, the glory, the state-funded silken empire never took root, what grew instead was wild and quiet and deeply human. But even wildflowers have seasons. One winter, your joints stiffen. You begin to nap more. Your fingers forget how to pull fine thread on the first try. The mulberry tree out back, which you planted from seed, develops a lean like it's bowing toward you. One by one, your original protégés return. They're older now, but still carry themselves with that particular grace that comes from having raised worms and woven patience. One runs a weaving studio in Vermont. Another brought sericulture to an orphanage in Detroit. A third turned her family's abandoned orchard into a dye garden. They sit by your bed, bring ginger tea, stitch a quilt in the evenings that tells your story in thread and silence. You drift in and out. Sometimes you dream of rooms full of silk reels and chimneys pumping steam into the sky. Other times you dream of your worms, all grown, walking on two legs, wearing waistcoats and reading the newspaper. You begin telling stories, old ones, of how the silk idea first came to you, or how a worm once escaped into the church choir, or how a girl with one hand spun the most delicate thread anyone had ever seen. Sometimes you confuse memory and fable. No one corrects you. On one particularly clear afternoon, you ask to sit outside. They wheel you onto the porch, where the wind carries the scent of crushed leaves and faint lavender. A cocoon is dangling from a branch nearby, late, unexpected, stubborn. You point and laugh. That one never got the memo. Someone asks if you regret not building the factory. You think about it, then you shake your head. I'd rather have 1,000 girls with gentle hands than 10,000 machines. They write that down. It ends up in someone's diary, then in someone's article. Then years later, in a museum exhibit that features a recreation of your porch, complete with a rocking chair, a pot of marigolds, and a worn pair of embroidery scissors. You don't live forever, but your story refuses to end. A decade after your passing, a small publishing house releases a slim volume titled The Worm Lady of Pennsylvania, Letters and Lullabies from the Silk Porch. It's made of recycled cotton rag paper. The cover is hand-dyed. Inside are snippets of your letters, sketches, poems from visitors, and photos of silk pieces made by girls you once taught. The book becomes a quiet cult favorite among weavers, daydreamers, and lovers of lost causes. The old train station in town renames itself Cocoon Crossing. For a season, a theater troupe stages a puppet opera inspired by your life. Silkworms with felt eyes and high voices recounting your legacy through song. The state finally places a plaque near where your house once stood. It reads, "Here, dreams spun softer than industry, and longer." Children touch it with reverence, unsure what it means, but certain it means something important. And far away in a warm kitchen in a city you've never visited, a woman stitches a scarf in silk, her grandmother spun from a worm named Bramble. She tells her daughter the story of the Silk Lady. Not just the facts, but the feeling of it. The daughter nods and smiles. Because deep down she knows something adults often forget. That even things which never quite happen, the factories that never rise, the plans that never launch, the ideas that flutter off like moths, can still leave behind a thread. A beautiful, irreplaceable thread. And sometimes that's all you need. Open quote. Section 11. You don't remember when the letters stopped coming. Maybe it was after your last spring. Maybe the girls found new places to send them, new women to write to, new porches to lean on. Or maybe it's just how stories work. They bloom and drift and sometimes settle into soil far from where they started. But your story? It doesn't end with your death. It does something stranger. It molts. Years pass, then decades, then a century. And somewhere, tucked in a university basement in Pennsylvania, a graduate student named Eliza opens a water-stained archival box labeled simply, Silk Project, 1841. Inside, scraps of hand-woven cloth smelling faintly of cedar, handwritten recipes for mulberry tea, a singed diagram of a loom labeled Hope Map 2, dozens of brittle letters addressed in curving script to someone named Auntie Silk. Eliza didn't mean to find this box. She was supposed to be researching the textile mills of Lowell. But once she opens the lid, she's pulled in, spider slow, thread by thread. She starts reading, and before long she can't stop. She pores over every note, sketch, and ink-smudged worm doodle. One letter begins, "My worm has decided she is French and refuses to spin unless sung to." Eliza laughs out loud. She begins piecing it together. The timeline, the players, the strange ecosystem of girls, mulberry leaves, failed machines, and ferocious tenderness. She starts calling it the Quiet Silk Rebellion. A year later, she turns it into her thesis. 2 years after that, it's a TED Talk. She stands on a stage in red boots and a raw silk scarf, telling the world about a woman whose dream never became a factory, but did become a movement. She ends her talk with a photo, a yellowed image of your porch, draped in ivy, captioned, "Not all revolutions roar." The video goes viral. Suddenly, people want to know more. A podcast calls it the coziest forgotten uprising in American history. A craft magazine publishes a spread called Homespun Heroines, with you on the cover, cropped from a blurry photo, smiling mid-sentence, hands tangled in thread. A group of fiber artists organizes a mail-in tribute. They each spin one skein of silk in your honor and mail it to a central studio in Lancaster, which weaves it all together into a massive quilt of cloud-colored thread. They title it Unfinished Factory. It goes on display at the Smithsonian for 3 months, and that's just the beginning. Teachers start using your story in middle school lessons about alternative economies. Art therapists quote your diary in workshops. A short animated film wins an Indie Award for its gentle retelling of your porch and your poems and your girls with worm-named friends. Someone even writes a song, a lullaby, sung from the perspective of a silkworm who never left his box, but who dreamed of skies and lavender. It's beautiful, and strange, and perfect. Meanwhile, the old mulberry trees you once planted are gone. Time takes them as it does all things, but seedlings from them grow in window boxes across the country. People send photos of their leaves to a website dedicated to your Section 11. You don't remember when the letters stopped coming. Maybe it was after your last spring. Maybe the girls found new places to send them, new women to write to, new porches to lean on. Or maybe it's just how stories work. They bloom and drift and sometimes settle into soil far from where they started. But your story... Section 12. There's something odd about how legacy behaves when you're not around to see it. Like watching smoke curl from a candle you didn't realize had gone out. You're no longer alive in the way people are used to measuring, but you're unmistakably here, stitched into strange corners of the world where no one expected to find silk. For instance, a tiny bookstore in Kyoto stocks a translated version of The Quiet Silk Rebellion right beside the memoir of a bonsai master. Its handwritten shelf label reads, "Books about small things with very long shadows." Or, in a dusty repair shop in Pittsburgh, a mechanic keeps a framed embroidery above his bench that reads, "Finish nothing. Begin everything." He doesn't know where the quote came from, just that his grandmother stitched it into a tea towel after hearing it in a radio interview years ago. Or, in a virtual multiplayer game that simulates lost cities, one user has created an entire playable map called The Porch. It features a gentle level-up system where instead of fighting enemies, you feed silkworms, handwrite letters, and trade skeins of thread. The highest achievement you can earn is called Factory Unbuilt. But none of this was your plan. In fact, there never really was a plan, was there? There was only you and an empty room and a kind of hunger that couldn't be ignored. You never meant to shape a mythology. You only meant to feed the girls and calm their hands and find some softness between the noise of mills and the heaviness of inheritance. But maybe that's exactly why it stuck, because you weren't trying to save the world. You were just trying to keep it from unraveling. And the girls? Oh, the girls. Some of them grew up and married and forgot the difference between silk and satin. Others never left your porch. And some disappeared into cities with their pockets full of worm names and torn notebook pages and soft defiance. One of them, Margaret, you remember her, became a librarian. She taught entire classrooms how to make paper from mulberry bark. She never said your name in public, but she kept your letters in her desk and reread them like scripture. Another, Rachel, opened a home for girls who had nowhere else to go. She painted a worm in gold on the front gate, small and subtle. No one but her ever understood it. And there was Eliza, of course, the researcher, the one who pulled you back from the edge of being forgotten entirely. You would have liked her. She's got your stubbornness and your sense of timing. She ends her lectures with a joke you would have appreciated. If you ever feel like your ideas are too small to matter, just remember that Pennsylvania almost had a silk empire because one woman believed in worms. You'd have laughed, maybe shaken your head, but deep down, you'd be proud. Because maybe the empire never happened, but the echo did. And isn't that stranger? That sometimes the shadow of a thing outlasts the thing itself? That your empty barn became a sort of temple? That your failed experiments became blueprints for softer futures? That girls long after your death are still passing secret silk messages, folded, stitched, unraveled, rewoven? You are folklore now. You are not on currency. There is no statue of you in the town square. But when the wind catches just right and someone finds themselves inexplicably reaching for a thimble, or sitting a little longer on a front porch, or writing something they know no one else will read, that's when you stir. Not a ghost. Just a draft in the door. A flutter on the edge of memory. A story someone heard once but isn't sure if they made up. And maybe that's better than a monument, because monuments crumble, but myths migrate. Section 13. Somewhere along the road, someone finally found the box. It was in the back of a dry goods store in Easton, Pennsylvania, wedged between old cheese crates and a cabinet full of mason jar lids. The store was closing down for good, and the new owners were clearing everything out when they found it. A slim wooden box, the lid warped from decades of humidity, no lock, no name. Inside, a tangle of pale blue ribbon, brittle silk scraps folded like wilted petals, and a notebook that smelled like mothballs and mildew. You, of course, would have recognized it instantly. It was the second ledger, the one you kept tucked behind the kitchen flour bin. Not the real books, the ones with supply lists and permit numbers and budgets you begrudgingly submitted to the local township every season. This was the other one, the one where you wrote ideas in the margins, where you tallied eggs with question marks, where you recorded dreams like data. The new owners didn't know what they were looking at. They donated the box to the local historical society, who shelved it for months before a bored intern finally opened it and started flipping pages. She didn't understand most of what she read, but she couldn't stop reading. There was something about the handwriting. Not elegant, not neat, but deliberate. Slanted just slightly upward, like you were always reaching toward something just out of frame. There were worm counts next to grocery lists. There were ink smudges beside words like hypothesis and needle snap. There were letters you wrote to yourself, signed Love Anyway. She scanned the pages, uploaded them to an obscure online archive, gave the file a quiet title, Silkworm Notes, 1894-98. You didn't trend. There was no viral moment, no BuzzFeed article. But the document started quietly making the rounds among people who cared about strange things. Textile historians, feminist archivists, folks who knit their own scarves and ferment their own cabbage, people who understood that unfinished things sometimes hold more power than perfect ones. And that's how the legend grew. Your name, half misspelled, half mispronounced, started cropping up in footnotes and zines and oddly tender TikToks made by soft-spoken women in overalls. Your porch got mentioned in a podcast about utopian failures. Your worm wrapping method became a DIY technique in a fiber arts magazine called Spindle. Then, eventually, inevitably, a play. It premiered in a 40-seat theater in Brooklyn. No set, no props, just one actor and a basket of yarn. It was called The Woman Who Fed Worms to the Wind. You'd have hated it. Too sentimental. Too poetic. And yet, maybe you would have sat in the back row, arms crossed, pretending not to care. Pretending not to notice the part where the actress took off her shoes and said, "She never built the factory, but she built the girls." Maybe that line would have landed in your chest like a stone. Maybe for the first time in years, centuries, you'd have let yourself feel the scale of it all. Not the scope of what didn't happen, but the resonance of what nearly did. Because the truth is, some ideas are too alive to stay put. They move sideways. They hitch rides on other people's stories. They find cracks and grow through them like stubborn weeds or clever vines or, yes, caterpillars. Even now, there are workshops being taught in community centers about the porch method. They begin not with silk, but with silence. They teach patience first, listening second, threadwork last. Even now, there are teenagers wearing screen-printed hoodies with your handwriting on the back. The quote is from the ledger, page 47. Some things are meant to unravel. That's how they breathe. Even now, there are city gardens with little brass plaques that say, "This soil once dreamed of silk." You're still not famous, but you're undeniable. And isn't that its own kind of arrival, to become folklore that walks around with other people's feet? To be a nearly factory in Pennsylvania that somehow wove itself into the fabric of people who never knew your name, but know how to carry your gentleness. Section 14. The land where your mulberries once stood? It's a parking lot now. You probably saw that coming. They dug up the last root in 1972 when the Borough Council approved the construction of a multi-use commercial plaza. The hardware store left in 1981. The ice cream stand held on till 1994. Then the bank came, then left. Now there's a vape shop, 2 nail salons, and a laundromat that closes on Tuesdays for some reason. But sometimes, when the rain hits just right and the pavement steams in that peculiar late June way, someone says it smells faintly of jam. The kind of scent that makes you stop walking. The kind that insists on being remembered. Of course, you wouldn't say it was yours. You always said you were borrowing the land, not owning it. Just like you borrowed the worms and the girl's attention and the old man's dusty barn. Everything you touched, you treated like a favor. Even the future. That's why there was never a monument. No bronze statue, no sepia portrait hung in a courthouse, not even a plaque bolted to the broken gate. Just stories. Soft ones. The kind you tell under your breath or while darning socks. The kind you pass on without noticing. There's a woman now, one town over, who starts each spring by whispering to her garden. She doesn't remember where she learned it, but she always says, "Wake up, you silkless miracle," to the marigolds. There's a kid who wrote an entire science fair project on the life cycle of the American silkworm. He printed photos from the archive, used excerpts from your ledger. His teacher gave him a B-, but asked for the link to the source. And there's a seamstress in Pittsburgh who swears she once touched a ribbon in a thrift store bin that nearly hummed in her palm. Pale blue. Stiff with time, but somehow alive. You're still here, in pieces, in gestures, in small routines that no one taught, but everyone recognizes. That's the thing with almost histories. They ripple. You never got your factory, never cut the ceremonial ribbon, never stamped "Made in Pennsylvania" onto bolts of shining cloth. But you made a system, a strange, tender system that never required walls. You created loops, and loops don't end, they return. So maybe the story isn't about failure at all. Maybe it's about fidelity, to the dream of doing something carefully, to the idea that effort, even unfinished, leaves a trace. And what's silk, anyway, if not the residue of a body's slow labor? What's legacy, if not something that clings gently to someone else's fingers long after you've left the room? People still ask what happened to the Pennsylvania silk factory, why it never got built. They comb records, they interview great-grandnieces, they theorize about funding shortfalls and the collapse of mulberry futures. But the real answer doesn't live in a ledger. It lives in the marrow of actions no one saw. The pot stirred, the girls mentored, the soil turned, the ribbon saved, and the decision, every single morning, to begin anyway. You weren't just trying to build something, you were becoming something. Something that didn't need permission, something that didn't mind if no one noticed, something that shimmered quietly in the corner of the story. Like silk, yes, but wilder. Like silk that decided it didn't need to be woven to mean something. Section 15. The funny thing about silk is that once upon a time it was considered too precious to be touched. Literally. In ancient China, during the height of the Han Dynasty, only the emperor's household could legally wear it, and even then, certain weaves were reserved just for him. Touching imperial silk was a crime. Owning it was treason. You, naturally, would have found this hilarious. Because if you had managed to build that Pennsylvania silk factory, the very first thing you would have done is hand out samples like candy. To local kids, to the widow who ran the bookshop, to the grumpy man who sold coal and always said, "What's the point of silk in a coal town?" You weren't in it for prestige. You were in it for texture. The same way a baker is in it for the smell, or a gardener for the weight of damp soil, or a teacher for that moment a kid's face lights up mid-sentence. You liked how silk felt between your fingers. Warm, almost oily. You liked that it came from something alive, that it unraveled, that it refused to be rushed, and you wanted to give that feeling away. You had this whole plan, one of your sillier ones really, for a Silk Day festival. There'd be a parade, children would dress up as caterpillars, you even doodled the design for a float shaped like a giant cocoon. You had this fantasy of women hanging skeins of dyed silk from their porches like flags. Let the neighborhood shimmer, you'd grin. But silk, as it turned out, had its own ideas. It didn't want a factory, it wanted gardens. It wanted soft-spoken girls and careful hands and barn beams and the slow patience of real time. It wanted soil, so it took the factory plans and quietly, respectfully turned them to compost. You didn't fight it, you just adjusted. That was your true skill, wasn't it? Not dreaming big, but reshaping dreams when they didn't land. You were always editing, pruning, bending toward what was possible. A lesser person would have called that failure. You called it silk thinking. And maybe that's why people kept trusting you even when you couldn't deliver what you promised. You didn't promise output, you promised care. And that's what you gave. You never made a fortune, but you made a name. The kind of name people utter when they're trying to remember how to begin something brave. It's said that in 1956, a woman in New Jersey wrote a poem about you. She found your story in a footnote in an agricultural journal and couldn't stop thinking about it. The poem was called Almost Factory. It ran only once, in a tiny mimeographed literary zine. But someone kept it. It's now in the archive at the University of Delaware. Filed under Local Curiosities. The last lines read, "No blueprints left. Just string, just braith, just hands remembering how to hold what never came." It's strange, isn't it? You never asked to be remembered. But memory insisted. And like silk, it found its own way. Through poems, through rumors, through gardens where the worms once wriggled. And now, through this story, the one being told softly while someone drifts toward sleep. Maybe even someone like you, who never did believe in endings, only cocoons. Open quote. Open quote. Open quote. Section 16. You'd think the dream would have died right there, after the soil proved too cold, after the silkworms went dormant, after the third or fourth investor quietly took their hat and left. But no. That's not how your kind of dream dies. It frays, it splinters, it drifts sideways into new shapes. And that's what it did. You still had the barn, you still had the porch with the squeaky step. You still had that big cedar table where people always seemed to gather whether you invited them or not. You still had time, and hands, and a stubborn sort of hope that stuck to the corners of your plans like cobwebs. So you turned toward what you had left, the community. Not in the shiny, let's form a committee way, but in the slow, neighborly way. You began inviting people to come sit in the barn on Saturdays. At first, it was just tea and awkward conversation. A potluck without the pot. Then someone brought preserves. Then a fiddler came. Then someone showed up with spinning wheels they'd inherited but never used. The barn filled not with looms, but with stories, and eventually with threads. You started calling it the Cocoon Club, half as a joke. There wasn't a membership or dues or rules, just whoever showed up. Some tried weaving, some painted, a few just napped in the hayloft, which you didn't mind at all. You said rest was part of the process. And every so often, someone asked you what had happened to the silk factory. Weren't you the one trying to bring the East to the West? They'd chuckle. You never bristled, just smiled. The worms changed their minds, you'd say. And I listened. One autumn afternoon, a teacher brought her students. They'd been studying local industries that never materialized. You pulled out your notebooks and showed them diagrams of the factory that almost was, the kind of blueprints that crackle when unfolded. The kids looked bored until you handed them spindles. That's when the real lesson started. You taught them to twist fiber into thread, not silk, but wool that someone had donated. It took hours. The kids grew fidgety, impatient. But when the first little length of yarn came out smooth and even, something shifted. You could feel it in the room. They'd made something from nothing. And you could see, behind one or two eyes, the glimmer of understanding. This is what industry really is. Not machines, not money, but hands, patience, will. That winter, the Cocoon Club hosted its first little market. Not many came, But those who did left with fingerless gloves, beeswax candles, knitted bookmarks, and stories about the strangest factory that never made anything except warmth. Years later, some of those kids would grow up and start studios of their own. They'd say they learned the idea from a lady who never gave up on thread. They never remembered your name, but they remembered your laugh, your tea, your belief that small work mattered. They remembered that in a barn on the edge of a Pennsylvania town, industry meant something quieter, something slower. Not the roar of machines, but the hush of hands working in tandem. Section 17. Eventually, of course, the state came calling. Not in a hostile way, not with lawyers or back taxes or red tape, but in that uniquely bureaucratic way where curiosity and oversight wear the same suit. Someone had filed a report about unused agricultural grants. Someone else had noted the term factory still floating around your property's designation. And then a young man from the Department of Economics says, something showed up with a clipboard and too much gel in his hair. He smiled too much, and didn't remove his shoes when he stepped into your barn. Miss, he began, peering around at the looms and beeswax candles and teens giggling by a dye vat, we're just here to clarify some records. You understand, a few inconsistencies in the business registry. You offered him tea. He declined. You offered him a seat. He stood, and then he asked, very politely, if the factory existed. Define exist, you said, wrapping a skein of indigo wool around your fingers. That got him blinking. You walked him through the barn, not just physically, but narratively. You showed him the plans you'd filed, the letters you'd written, the Silkworm invoices still folded in a drawer like little paper ghosts. You even pointed out the original site where the steam engine was supposed to go. It was a fire pit now. Someone had left marshmallow sticks in the ash. And then you looked him square in the eye and said, it existed where all factories start, in the head and heart. The rest just never caught up. He didn't know what to write down. Eventually he scribbled something on the back of a flyer and thanked you, said he'd be in touch. He never was. But something shifted after that visit. Maybe word got around. Maybe your little experiment had become local lore. Because the trickle of visitors became a steady stream. Textile students, art therapists, retirees, urban herbalists who wanted to learn to grow their own dye plants. The Cocoon Club expanded. You never called it that officially. There was no website, no official signage. Just a wooden sign someone painted by hand and hung on the barn door. The O's looked like sleeping caterpillars. And the silk dream? It never quite died. You kept a few silkworms in a wooden crate, nestled in a drawer. Just as a reminder. Every spring, they'd wake up. They didn't always make it. But when they did, they'd start spinning like they didn't care that the market had moved on without them. One summer, a young woman named Dottie, who smelled faintly of patchouli and always brought her dog, figured out how to harvest a few cocoons and reel a thread. It was too fine to use, really, more a novelty than a product. But she did it. She handed you the spool one evening as the sun turned the barn floor amber. Thought you should be the first. You held it like glass. The dream wasn't dead. It was just quieter now. Less ambitious, more precious. You wound that tiny silk thread around a nail on the wall, next to a faded photograph of the original Pennsylvania Silk Committee. They had tried. You had tried. And somewhere between the failed factories and forgotten grant forms, a different kind of industry had emerged. One made of community, of imagination, of refusing to let a no be the end. You never filed another business proposal again, but your barn never sat empty. Open quote, open quote, open quote. Awaiting continue. Section 18. Winter came early that year. Not the punishing kind, but a slow, creeping chill that slid down from the hills like it had something to prove. You'd always liked autumn best. Crisp apples, crunchy leaves, the rich smell of wool. But this year the season turned its back fast. Before you could blink, the barn windows fogged with breath, and the mulberry trees stood naked and spindly like embarrassed dancers in the yard. You weren't sure whether to keep the Cocoon Club open through the cold. Everyone assumed you would. No one asked. They just kept showing up. They brought their own thermoses now. One woman baked barley scones. A boy from 3 towns over biked in with samples of mushroom-based dye experiments, wrapped in napkins like sacred offerings. Someone knitted an actual silk cotton blend hat that, when tried on, made you look slightly like a wizard. You wore it all week. But inside, you started to wonder, had the dream overstayed its welcome? It hadn't gone bad. Nothing dramatic had happened. No burst pipes, no fire, no betrayal. Just the quiet settling in of a question. How long do you keep doing something when the thing it was meant to be never quite arrived? Pennsylvania was full of ghosts like this, old paper mills that turned into wedding venues, trolley lines paved over and renamed Liberty Ave, entire railways lost to weeds. And yet people remembered. Not the failures exactly, but the outlines of what had once almost been. Your almost silk factory was just one more addition to the map of what might have beens. A gentle echo of a thing that had nearly come true. One day you decided to close for a week. No classes, no open barn hours. You left a little note on the door, gone dreaming, back soon. You expected disappointment, maybe even resentment, but when you returned, you found the barn swept clean. Someone had waxed the looms. A new die chart hung on the wall, and someone no one ever admitted who had scrawled in soft chalk across the inside of the barn door, "Dreams still spin here." It made you cry. Not in a big cinematic way, just a couple of tears, silent and quick, like your body was letting off a pressure valve. You ran your hand over the words. You thought of the women who tried to bring silk to this valley long before you, thought of their hats and their hopes, the cold wooden benches they'd sat on in town halls, the brochures, the imported worms, the steam-powered dreams. You wondered if they'd ever cried too. And then something strange happened. That winter, the silkworms spun early. You hadn't even expected them to hatch. It had been too cold. The crate was barely insulated, but there they were, small and white and determined, spinning in the dark like nothing could stop them. You didn't tell anyone at first. It felt like a secret, but the silk was smooth, finer than before. You reeled it slowly, reverently, like pulling thread from a cloud. You dyed it soft ochre, wove it into a square of fabric, just big enough for a handkerchief. You carried it in your pocket for weeks, and then on a snowy evening near the solstice, you folded it into an envelope and mailed it, no note, no return address, to the Department of Economic something. Let them wonder, let them know. The silk dream was never dead. It just didn't need a factory to survive. Open quote, open quote, open quote, awaiting continue, close quote, close quote, close quote. Section 19 by now, you've stopped calling it the Cocoon Club. It's just the barn again, and everyone knows what that means. People still come by, sometimes on Sunday afternoons with old dye recipes scribbled on napkins, or with bundles of wild goldenrod they swear will make a buttery yellow. But there are fewer rules now. No formal classes, no fee schedules, no posters, just people, just silk, just quiet joy. You've learned to accept the fact that nothing turned out quite the way the original Pennsylvania Silk Project envisioned. There was no Victorian palace of mulberry-lined courtyards, no international trade hub, no railway station-sized reeling house. But in a way, that makes the silk sweeter. Because what you have now didn't come from any blueprint or economic plan. It came from persistence, from curiosity, and from the smallest acts of care. You remember that day last spring, the one with the warm breeze that smelled like sugar and moss. A little girl came in with her grandmother. She couldn't have been more than 6. She wore rubber boots even though the sun was shining, and clutched a battered stuffed rabbit in one hand. She stared at the mulberry trees like they were unicorns. You showed her a cocoon. She gasped. You showed her how the worm wriggles before it spins. She whispered, "That's magic." And you smiled, because honestly, she wasn't wrong. You gave her a dried cocoon to take home, told her she could put it under her pillow like a lucky charm. She beamed, and when she turned to leave, she told her grandmother, "When I grow up,
Hey,
I'm gonna make
I'm
flowers."
Joey, and I'm...
You stood still for a long time after they left, holding your hands open, just feeling the weight of what that meant. Sometimes the dream doesn't have to be grand to be real.
एक ही जगह पे आपने कंटेंट को लिखवा भी लेना है, उसको टेक्स्ट टू वॉइस में कन्वर्ट कर देना है, फिर उसी वॉइस में
A
म्यूजिक
nearby
साउंड
elementary school invited you to speak at Bug Day. Someone printed a local zine titled Threaded Histories and featured your story on page 2, right under an article about mushroom farms in coal mines. Then the town council contact you about potentially naming a small lane behind the barn Silkworm Way. You laughed so hard when you got that letter, you nearly dropped your loom shuttle. But deep down, you were proud, not in a big, trumpet-blaring way, but quietly, softly. The kind of pride that grows like lichen on a stone wall, slow, patient, content to be overlooked by most. Because you knew the truth. You hadn't just kept the silk dream alive. You'd transformed it. You'd taken something Pennsylvania never quite built and made something new. Not an industry, not a factory, but a rhythm, a practice. And maybe that was the whole point. The original silk investors had wanted permanence, profit, scale. But silk isn't like coal or steel. It doesn't yield to force. You can't mine it, you have to tend it, trust it, give it time. In that way, silk is like community, or memory, or healing. And sure, maybe none of that shows up on a census or an industrial ledger, but it shows up when people laugh together over indigo-stained fingers. It shows up when someone learns to pull a single thread without breaking it. It shows up in every soft square of hand-woven cloth tucked into a pocket on a cold day. Pennsylvania didn't get the silk empire it hoped for. It got something better. It got a quiet, odd little miracle. And somehow you were the one to carry it forward. Just one more thread in the endless tapestry of what almost wasn't, but somehow still is. Open quote,